3,000 years ago, a woman vanished from history at the height of her power. No body, no tomb, no trace. Just silence where there should have been monuments. Tonight, we're going to walk through the evidence, theory by theory, chamber by chamber, following the clues that might finally reveal where Nefertiti rests. Picture the Valley of the Kings in 1922. Howard Carter stands at the entrance to a tomb, his candle flickering in the darkness. "Can you see anything?" his patron asks from behind. Carter's response would become legendary. Yes, wonderful things. But he wasn't looking at Nefertiti's tomb. He'd found Tutankhamun, the boy king whose name meant almost nothing before that moment. Yet Tutankhamun's aunt, or possibly stepmother, the woman who'd ruled beside Akhenaten during Egypt's most radical religious revolution, remained lost. The mystery deepens when you consider what we know about royal Egyptian funerals. These weren't quiet affairs. The process took 70 days of ritual, involved hundreds of priests, required enormous quantities of materials, and left extensive records. Somehow, despite this elaborate system, one of Egypt's most powerful women disappeared without leaving the paper trail we'd expect. Either her burial was so thoroughly hidden that it survived 3 millennia of tomb robbers, or something unprecedented happened to her remains. Let's start with what we actually know. Nefertiti appears in Egyptian records around 1370 BCE, becoming great royal wife to Pharaoh Akhenaten. Her name means, "the beautiful one has come," and the surviving artwork suggests this wasn't mere propaganda. The famous limestone bust, discovered in 1912, shows a woman of striking symmetry. Though we should remember that Egyptian royal art served political purposes as much as aesthetic ones. What matters more than her appearance is her unprecedented prominence in state reliefs and inscriptions. In typical Egyptian royal iconography, queens appeared smaller than their pharaoh husbands, positioned slightly behind or to the side. Nefertiti breaks this pattern. She appears the same size as Akhenaten, sometimes even in dominant positions. One relief shows her striking enemies, a scene previously reserved for male pharaohs. Another depicts her performing rituals alone, without Akhenaten present. These aren't minor artistic choices, they're statements about power. Then, around year 12 of Akhenaten's reign, something shifts. Nefertiti's name starts appearing with different titles. Some inscriptions suggest she became co-regent, sharing full pharaonic power with her husband. Other evidence hints she might have changed her name entirely, possibly becoming the mysterious pharaoh Nefertiti. This gets complicated because Egyptian naming conventions and title usage weren't as rigid as we'd like them to be for easy historical analysis. The confusion multiplies when Akhenaten dies. Someone rules after him, before young Tutankhamun takes the throne. Was it Nefertiti? Was it Nefertiti using a different name? The evidence points in multiple directions simultaneously, like trying to reconstruct a conversation from echoes in an empty room. Now, we reach the central question. If Nefertiti died during this period, where did they bury her? The traditional assumption placed royal burials in the Valley of the Kings, that narrow canyon on the west bank of the Nile where Egypt's New Kingdom pharaohs carved their eternal resting places into limestone cliffs. Except Nefertiti and Akhenaten didn't follow tradition. They'd moved Egypt's capital to a new city, Akhetaten, modern-day Amarna. They'd abandoned the old gods for exclusive worship of the Aten, the sun disk. They'd restructured Egyptian society from the top down. Why would they suddenly conform to traditional burial practices? Akhenaten prepared a tomb for himself at Amarna, in the eastern cliffs across from his new city. The tomb included burial chambers for members of his family. Archaeologists found evidence that at least one royal woman was buried there initially. But here's where it gets interesting. When later pharaohs restored the traditional religion and abandoned Amarna, they moved the royal mummies back to Thebes, or at least they moved some of them. In 1907, Theodore Davis discovered a small tomb in the Valley of the Kings, designated KV55. Inside lay a coffin that had been altered, with cartouches chiseled out and gold leaf torn away. The mummy inside had decomposed badly, making identification difficult. Initial analysis suggested a young man, possibly Akhenaten's son or brother. Later studies proposed it might be Akhenaten himself. The most recent examinations, using DNA analysis, indicate it's probably Tutankhamun's father, which could be Akhenaten, but the evidence isn't definitive. The tomb also contained equipment inscribed with Nefertiti's name, along with items belonging to other Amarna royals. This is the first theory about Nefertiti's location. She's somewhere in the Valley of the Kings, in a tomb we haven't found yet, or in a tomb we've found but haven't properly identified. The valley isn't a simple place. It branches into smaller wadis, contains dozens of tombs in various states of completion, and has been thoroughly picked over by both ancient robbers and modern archaeologists. Finding a new tomb isn't impossible, but it's increasingly unlikely, unless you look more carefully at what's already been found. In 1898, Victor Loret discovered KV35, the tomb of Amenhotep II. In a small side chamber, he found 3 mummies, all female, all unidentified. Egyptologists labelled them the elder lady, the younger lady, and a third mummy of a young boy. These weren't formal burials. Someone had moved these bodies here, stripped them of identifying marks, and left them in what amounted to a storage room. Why? DNA testing in 2010 revealed that the younger lady was Tutankhamun's mother. This created immediate excitement because if she's Tutankhamun's mother, and if Tutankhamun was Akhenaten's son, then the younger lady might be Nefertiti, except the DNA also showed that the younger lady was Akhenaten's sister, making her both sister and wife, which was possible in Egyptian royal families, but complicates the Nefertiti identification. Some Egyptologists argue this proves Nefertiti wasn't Tutankhamun's mother. Others suggest the DNA results might be misinterpreted, or that family relationships were more complex than we understand. The elder lady presents an even more intriguing possibility. She's older, she shows signs of having been roughly handled at some point, and her face bears damage that might have been deliberate. DNA links her to the royal family, but not in a way that conclusively identifies her. Could this be Nefertiti, deliberately defaced and hidden after Akhenaten's religious revolution was reversed? The face damage would make sense if later pharaohs wanted to erase her memory while still providing some form of burial. But this is speculation built on speculation. Let's shift perspective entirely. What if Nefertiti never made it to the Valley of the Kings at all? Nicholas Reeves, a British Egyptologist, proposed something that sent ripples through the archaeological community in 2015. He'd been studying high-resolution scans of Tutankhamun's tomb, looking at the wall paintings with fresh eyes and modern technology. The scans revealed something curious, straight lines in the decorated plaster, lines that might indicate sealed doorways. Tutankhamun's tomb is weird. Every Egyptologist acknowledges this. It's too small for a pharaoh, even a minor one who died young. The layout is cramped. Some of the grave goods appear to have been made for someone else, with Tutankhamun's name hastily substituted. The burial seems rushed, as if they needed to inter him quickly and used whatever was available. The tomb's axis is wrong for a king's burial. Everything about it suggests it wasn't originally meant for Tutankhamun. Reeves proposed that what we call Tutankhamun's tomb is actually just the entrance corridor and antechamber of a much larger tomb. The burial chamber where Tutankhamun's mummy rests, that might have been a storage room in the original design. Behind the decorated walls, Reeves suggested, lies the rest of the tomb, and that tomb was built for Nefertiti. The theory goes like this. Nefertiti died or disappeared while she was at the height of her power, possibly as pharaoh in her own right. She received a full royal burial in a substantial tomb. Then Tutankhamun died unexpectedly at age 19. The officials needed to bury him quickly, within the traditional 70 days. Rather than carving a new tomb, they broke through into Nefertiti's tomb through a side corridor, creating the odd layout we see today. They sealed the rest of the tomb behind plastered and decorated walls, leaving Nefertiti's burial chamber intact beyond. The evidence supporting this starts with those straight lines in the wall scans. They're there. You can see them in the published images. The question is what they mean. Are they doorways or just cracks in the plaster, or construction joints from how the tomb was originally built? Reeves also points to specific details in the wall paintings. One scene shows Tutankhamun's successor, I, performing the opening of the mouth ceremony on a mummy. Standard stuff. But look closely at the mummy. It's depicted with different iconography than other scenes of Tutankhamun. Reeves argues this is because the artist was copying an original painting that showed Tutankhamun performing the ritual for Nefertiti. When they repurposed the tomb, they painted I over Tutankhamun and kept Nefertiti as the mummy, but in the rush, didn't update all the details. This interpretation requires you to accept several assumptions about artistic conventions and restoration practices. Not everyone does. But the physical lines in the walls demand some explanation. The Egyptian government authorized radar scans in 2016 to investigate. The first team, from Japan, reported positive results suggesting hollow spaces behind the north and west walls of the burial chamber. The second team, using different equipment, found nothing conclusive. A third scan in 2018 concluded the previous readings were probably natural features in the limestone, not hidden chambers. So we're back where we started, except now we have contradictory technical data to argue about in addition to the circumstantial evidence. But let's say, just for the sake of following the thread, that Reeves is right. What would we find behind those walls? Based on how Egyptian tomb design worked, there would likely be a corridor, possibly with additional storage rooms, leading to a larger burial chamber. That chamber would contain Nefertiti's sarcophagus, probably nested coffins similar to Tutankhamun's, and whatever grave goods survived ancient robbery. The artwork would show scenes from the Book of the Dead, images of Nefertiti before the gods, possibly unique iconography related to Atenism, if she was buried during or shortly after Akhenaten's reign. The implications go beyond just finding another mummy. Nefertiti's tomb would contain texts, inscriptions that might clarify her relationship to Akhenaten, her role in the Amarna period, possibly even explain what happened during those mysterious years when she seemed to disappear from records. Did she fall from power, die naturally, rule under another name? The tomb might answer questions that have puzzled Egyptologists for a century. There's also the matter of treasure. Tutankhamun's tomb, small and robbed twice in antiquity, still contained over 5,000 objects. If Nefertiti received a full royal burial in a larger tomb that remained sealed, we're talking about a potentially unprecedented archaeological discovery. But that's not really what drives the investigation. The historical knowledge matters more than gold masks and jewelry. The debate over hidden chambers in Tutankhamun's tomb has become intensely political. Tourism is crucial to Egypt's economy, and a discovery like this would be enormous for attracting visitors. That creates pressure to find something, which makes some archaeologists cautious about rushing to conclusions. There's also the question of what investigation methods to use. Ground-penetrating radar is non-invasive, but it's not always accurate in limestone environments. Drilling small inspection holes would be more definitive, but risks damaging priceless artwork. Breaking through a wall to investigate would be straightforward but catastrophic if the hypothesis is wrong. As of now, the official position is that there are no hidden chambers, or at least no evidence strong enough to justify destructive investigation. Reeves maintains his theory, pointing to details in the scans that he believes others are misinterpreting. The argument continues in academic journals and conference presentations, both sides marshalling evidence, neither able to definitively prove their case without physical access to what might or might not exist behind the walls. We need to consider one more possibility, darker and more prosaic than hidden treasure chambers. What if Nefertiti's tomb was found, robbed, and destroyed long ago, and we simply don't recognize the remains? Ancient Egypt suffered waves of tomb robbery. The priests knew this. By the end of the New Kingdom, they were finding royal tombs systematically looted, mummies torn apart in the search for amulets and gold. Their solution was to gather the royal mummies and hide them in two caches, essentially moving the pharaohs to unmarked safe locations. These caches were discovered in the late 1800s, yielding dozens of royal mummies that had been stripped of their original burial goods and rewrapped with simple labels indicating who they were. Nefertiti might be among them, mislabeled or unlabeled. The priests who moved the mummies worked quickly, several centuries after the burials. They might not have known who all the bodies were, especially from the controversial Amarna period. A female mummy from that era, lacking clear identification, could easily have been lumped in with others and given a generic designation. This is the least satisfying answer, but possibly the most realistic. The romance of hidden chambers and sealed tombs appeals to us. But the mundane reality of ancient robbery and hasty preservation efforts might be what actually happened. Nefertiti's mummy could be sitting in the Cairo Museum right now, catalogued as unknown woman, while we search for hidden doorways and argue about radar scans. Before we move forward to examine what recent archaeological work has revealed, we should understand the physical layout of where all this is supposedly happening. The Valley of the Kings isn't a single valley. It's a branching system of wadis, dry riverbeds that cut through limestone hills. The main valley contains most of the known tombs, but smaller branches extend into the cliffs, some explored, some not. The tombs aren't randomly placed. Egyptian architects chose locations based on rock quality, accessibility, and concealment. A good tomb required limestone stable enough to carve without collapse, positioned where flash floods wouldn't fill the corridors with debris, but hidden enough that robbers wouldn't immediately spot the entrance. Most tombs follow a similar pattern. A stairway or corridor descends into the cliff, sometimes straight, sometimes with turns designed to confuse robbers, or align with religious symbolism. The passage leads to an antechamber, then typically a burial chamber, with side rooms for storing grave goods. The walls are covered in religious texts and images meant to guide the deceased through the afterlife. When Howard Carter discovered Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922, he found something unusual. The tomb was small, really small for a pharaoh. 4 rooms total. The corridors were narrow and low. The burial chamber barely accommodated the nested shrines around the sarcophagus. This wasn't the grand eternal resting place you'd expect for a king. That modest size is actually why the tomb survived intact. Robbers hid it twice in antiquity, but officials caught them quickly and resealed everything. The small entrance got covered by debris from later tomb construction, specifically when workers cut Ramesses VI's tomb nearby. Limestone chips and rubble buried Tutankhamun's doorway, and robbers forgot it existed. Now, Nicholas Reeves looked at those cramped rooms and saw something nobody else had. He noticed that the burial chamber's proportions seemed wrong, as if it had been modified from something else. The walls didn't match. One wall appeared smoother, more finished, as if it had been plastered over something. He measured everything carefully, compared it to other tombs, and realized the dimensions matched what you'd expect for a queen's burial, not a pharaoh's. Here's where it gets specific. The burial chamber's western wall, behind the shrines that held the sarcophagus, shows continuous decoration. The painting flows naturally across the entire surface. But the northern wall, the one Reeves thinks conceals a doorway, has discontinuities. The painting style changes slightly. The surface preparation appears different under certain lighting. And there are straight lines, too straight to be natural cracks, that could indicate a sealed doorway beneath the plaster. Reeves photographed these walls at different angles, under different light conditions, using both visible light and infrared. Infrared reveals what's beneath surface layers because different materials absorb and reflect infrared light differently. If there's a doorway cut into the limestone, then plastered over and painted, infrared should show the difference between solid rock and filled space. His photographs showed exactly that. Linear features running floor to ceiling, suggesting a doorway, and not just one. He identified two potential blocked passages, one on the north wall leading deeper into the cliff, one on the west wall leading to an adjacent chamber. The theory makes historical sense. Tutankhamun died young and unexpectedly. He was probably 18, maybe 19. Sudden death meant his tomb wasn't finished. The solution? Bury him in someone else's tomb. Someone who had died recently enough that their burial chamber was still accessible, but long enough ago that repurposing it wouldn't cause scandal. Nefertiti had vanished from records about 12 years before Tutankhamun's death. Perfect timing. If she had been buried in a tomb in the Valley of the Kings, that tomb would have been sealed, but not yet buried under debris. The priests could open it, add chambers for Tutankhamun, and seal everything again. They'd preserve the fiction that he had his own tomb while saving time on construction. This is where archaeology becomes detective work. You can't just accept the theory. You need evidence, multiple types of evidence, all pointing the same direction. Reeves had photographs suggesting hidden doorways. The next step was ground-penetrating radar. Radar works by sending electromagnetic pulses into the ground and measuring what bounces back. Different materials reflect radar differently. Solid limestone gives one signature. Air-filled voids give another. A chamber behind a wall should be obvious. A clear empty space where the radar shows nothing but air. The first radar survey in 2015 seemed to confirm Reeves's theory. Technicians ran the equipment over the tomb's walls and found anomalies. Spots where the return signal suggested empty space beyond. The data wasn't perfect. Limestone is notoriously difficult for radar because it's not uniform, but it showed something that could be chambers. Then came the complications. A second radar survey in 2016, using different equipment and different technicians, found nothing conclusive. The anomalies from the first survey didn't appear as clearly. The team running this survey concluded that what looked like chambers might just be natural variations in the limestone, pockets of different density that happen in sedimentary rock. Egypt's Antiquities Ministry brought in a third team, Italian experts who specialize in geophysical surveys of archaeological sites. They used more sophisticated equipment, multiple frequencies, different scanning angles. Their conclusion? Probably nothing there. The radar signatures that seemed so promising could be explained by the rock's natural structure without requiring hidden chambers. So now you have 3 surveys, 3 different results, and nobody agreeing on what the data means. This isn't unusual in archaeology. Geophysical surveys are tools, not magic. They require interpretation, and interpretation introduces human judgment, which introduces disagreement. The problem with limestone is that it's not consistent. A limestone cliff forms from accumulated sediment at the bottom of an ancient sea. Different layers settle at different times with different compositions. Some layers are dense and hard. Others are softer, more porous. When you send radar through this, you get reflections from all these boundaries between different layers, and it becomes really difficult to distinguish between natural geological features and human-made voids. Reeves argues that the teams dismissing his theory aren't accounting for the tomb's specific characteristics. The walls were plastered and painted, which creates another reflective surface that confuses the radar. You're not just scanning limestone, you're scanning limestone covered with plaster, covered with paint, and possibly covered with multiple layers of each, because ancient Egyptians often replastered and repainted surfaces. His critics say he's seeing patterns that aren't there, that the photograph anomalies are just cracks and natural variations in the plaster, and that the radar can't definitively prove anything in this environment. Without drilling or breaking through the wall, which Egypt won't authorize because of the risk to the paintings, the question remains unresolved. But let's assume for a moment that Reeves is right. What would it mean if there actually are chambers behind those walls? The implications go beyond just finding Nefertiti. It would mean our entire understanding of Tutankhamun's burial is wrong. It would suggest that ancient Egyptian priests were more pragmatic than we thought, willing to repurpose royal tombs when circumstances demanded it. It would open questions about how many other tombs in the valley might have hidden sections we've never investigated. More importantly, it would change how we excavate and study existing discoveries. Archaeologists have assumed that what you see is what you get. If a tomb appears to have 4 chambers, it has 4 chambers. The idea that finished painted walls might conceal additional passages means every tomb needs to be reconsidered, rescanned, investigated with fresh eyes and new technology. This connects to a broader issue in archaeology. The field's most famous discoveries happened a century ago, before modern documentation methods. Carter's excavation of Tutankhamun's tomb was meticulous for its time, but he didn't have infrared photography, ground-penetrating radar, or digital 3D mapping. He documented everything he could see, but he couldn't investigate what might be hidden. Now we have the technology, but we also have conservation concerns that limit what we can do. You can't just start drilling holes in a decorated tomb to check if there might be something behind the walls. The paintings are irreplaceable. Damaging them to pursue a theory, even a well-supported theory, is ethically complicated. Egypt faces a particular challenge here. The country depends heavily on tourism, and archaeological discoveries drive tourism. A find like hidden chambers in Tutankhamun's tomb would be international news, would bring millions of visitors, would generate enormous revenue. That creates pressure to investigate, to find something, to deliver the discovery that everyone wants. But it also creates pressure to be cautious. If you authorize invasive investigation and find nothing, you've damaged a World Heritage Site for no reason. If you find something, but the investigation causes harm to existing artifacts, you face international criticism. The decision makers are balancing scientific curiosity against preservation responsibility against economic interest, and there's no obvious right answer. The political dimension extends beyond Egypt. Foreign archaeologists working in Egypt operate under strict regulations and oversight. The relationship between Western archaeologists and Egyptian authorities has often been fraught, carrying echoes of colonial-era archaeology, when European excavators treated Egyptian artifacts as prizes to be shipped to museums in London, Paris, and Berlin. Reeves is British, working in a tradition of British Egyptology that goes back to Carter and before. Some Egyptian archaeologists are suspicious of foreign researchers promoting theories that require invasive investigation, seeing it as outsiders wanting to dig up Egypt for their own glory. Others welcome international collaboration and believe good archaeology transcends national boundaries. This tension affects what research gets approved and how it proceeds. A proposal from an Egyptian institution might receive different consideration than an identical proposal from a foreign university, not because of the science, but because of the politics surrounding who gets credit for discoveries and who controls access to Egypt's archaeological heritage. Meanwhile, the tomb sits there, unchanged, its walls keeping whatever secrets they might hold. Thousands of tourists walk through every year, looking at the painted walls, the empty sarcophagus, the small chambers that once held unimaginable treasures. Most don't know about the debate over hidden chambers. They see what's visible and assume that's everything. Carter himself might have missed something. When he excavated the tomb, his focus was on the incredible artifacts filling the chambers. He documented the architecture, measured the rooms, noted the decorations, but he was dealing with the overwhelming task of cataloguing thousands of objects while protecting them from deterioration and theft. Looking for hidden chambers behind finished walls wouldn't have been a priority. The technology available in the 1920s couldn't have detected sealed passages anyway. Carter worked with photographs, measurements, and visual inspection. If a wall looked solid and painted, he assumed it was solid. The idea that completed tomb walls might conceal additional passages wasn't part of archaeological thinking at that time. So there's a real possibility that something significant was missed, not through negligence, but simply through the limitations of early 20th century archaeology. Carter did revolutionary work with the tools he had. We have better tools now, but we also have constraints he didn't face, particularly regarding conservation and non-destructive investigation. The question becomes whether we're willing to accept uncertainty. Science usually demands definitive answers, but archaeology often can't provide them without destruction. You can theorize about what's behind a wall. You can scan it with every technology available, but until you break through, you won't know for sure. And if you break through and find nothing, you've permanently damaged something irreplaceable to satisfy curiosity. Some archaeologists argue that uncertainty is acceptable, that it's better to preserve what we have than risk it for what we might find. Others believe that knowledge justifies carefully planned investigation, that we have a responsibility to learn as much as possible about the past, even if it requires some risk to existing artifacts. Neither position is obviously wrong. This isn't a simple choice between good archaeology and bad archaeology. It's a genuine dilemma where legitimate values conflict, where the right course of action depends on how you weight competing priorities. What we can do is look at what else has been found, what other evidence might support or contradict the hidden chamber theory. The Valley of the Kings has been thoroughly explored, but thoroughly doesn't mean completely. New discoveries still happen, usually small things, but occasionally something significant that changes our understanding of how the valley was used and who might be buried there. The Valley of the Kings wasn't discovered all at once. It's been known for millennia, looted repeatedly in ancient times, visited by travelers throughout history. What we think of as its discovery is really the systematic archaeological exploration that began in the 19th century, and that process is still ongoing. Even in areas that seem thoroughly excavated, new findings appear. In 2006, a team found KV-63, a chamber containing coffins and storage jars. Not a royal tomb, probably a cache of mummification materials, but significant because it was discovered in a valley that supposedly had no more secrets. In 2008, KV-64 was found, another non-royal tomb that had been missed by centuries of exploration. These aren't spectacular discoveries like Tutankhamun's tomb, but they demonstrate that the valley still holds surprises despite intensive investigation. More relevant to our question, ground-penetrating radar surveys have revealed anomalies in several locations throughout the valley. Some of these anomalies might be natural geological features, voids in the limestone that were never carved or used. Others could be sealed passages or chambers that were cut, but then abandoned or filled. The limestone in the Valley of the Kings isn't uniform. It varies in quality, with some layers harder and more stable than others. Ancient tomb builders would sometimes start cutting a passage, encounter poor stone, and either change direction or abandon that section entirely. This geological variability creates challenges for modern investigation. A void detected by radar could be an ancient chamber, or it could be a natural cavity, or it could be an abandoned cutting that was filled with rubble and sealed. Without direct investigation, distinguishing between these possibilities is difficult. The radar tells you there's empty space, but it doesn't tell you whether that space is archaeologically significant. Tutankhamun's tomb itself shows evidence of this kind of adaptation. The burial chamber isn't perfectly aligned with the entrance passage. The turn happens at an angle that suggests the original plan was modified during construction. probably because they encountered problematic stone or needed to avoid an existing tomb. The ancient architects were pragmatic, working with the conditions they found rather than following rigid plans. Given this flexibility in ancient construction, the idea of hidden chambers becomes more plausible. If tomb builders were willing to modify plans, redirect passages, and adapt to geological conditions, they might well have created spaces that aren't obvious from the main tomb layout. A passage that leads nowhere visible might actually connect to a sealed chamber that was part of the original design, but concealed for security. Security was a serious concern. The ancient Egyptians knew their tombs would be targeted by thieves. They incorporated various protective measures: false doors, hidden shafts, blocked passages designed to confuse or deter robbers. Some tombs have passages that appear to dead end, but actually continue beyond deliberately constructed barriers. The builders were playing a long game, trying to protect their work for eternity against people who would be just as clever and determined as they were. Tutankhamun's tomb was robbed in antiquity, probably twice, shortly after it was sealed. The robbers broke through the sealed doorway, took small valuable items they could carry easily, and were apparently interrupted or discovered before they could do more extensive damage. The tomb was resealed, and then it disappeared from historical memory, buried under debris from later construction in the valley. That accidental concealment saved it from the systematic looting that emptied almost every other royal tomb. But those ancient robbers might have known things we don't. They lived closer to the time when the tomb was built, might have had access to records or oral traditions about its construction. If there were hidden chambers, thieves operating within a few years of the burial might have known where to look. Yet they apparently didn't find anything beyond the main chambers, or if they did, they left no evidence we've discovered. Of course, absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. Maybe the robbers never suspected there were hidden chambers. Maybe they did find additional spaces, but couldn't access them. Maybe they found chambers that were already empty, decoy rooms designed to waste a thief's time and effort. The ancient architects had to think like thieves, anticipate every method that might be used against their work. This brings us to the specific configuration of Tutankhamun's tomb, which is unusual in several ways. It's small for a royal tomb, much smaller than those prepared for longer reigning pharaohs. The prevailing theory is that Tutankhamun died unexpectedly young and was buried in a tomb originally intended for someone else, possibly a high official or even for his successor Ai. The tomb was quickly adapted for royal use, decorated hastily and packed with burial goods that barely fit in the available space. But what if that's not the complete story? What if the small, visible chambers are only part of a larger complex that was sealed off, either before or after the burial? If you're working under time pressure, preparing a tomb for an unexpected royal death, you might use what's immediately available while leaving other sections unfinished or inaccessible. The visible tomb could be the emergency solution, while a more elaborate space remained hidden, waiting for a completion that never came. This speculation isn't baseless. We know that royal tomb construction often took years, sometimes decades. The tombs were usually started when a pharaoh came to power and were supposed to be ready by their death. Tutankhamun ruled for only about 9 years, dying at 18 or 19. Any tomb prepared for him would have been nowhere near completion by normal standards. Using someone else's finished tomb makes sense, but it also means we might be looking at a structure that was never intended for him, that might have features we don't fully understand because we're interpreting it through the wrong context. The decorations support this interpretation. The paintings in the burial chamber are beautiful, but were executed quickly, without the refinement typical of royal tomb art. Some figures are slightly awkward, proportions occasionally off, details simplified. This is skilled work done fast, not the careful perfection you'd expect in a tomb prepared over many years. The artists were working under pressure, creating something magnificent, but doing it in weeks or months rather than years. What they painted is interesting too. The burial chamber walls show Tutankhamun's funeral procession, his mummy being transported, and rituals being performed. One scene shows Ai, who succeeded Tutankhamun as pharaoh, performing the opening of the mouth ceremony, a ritual that supposedly restored the deceased's senses in the afterlife. Another shows Tutankhamun being welcomed by various deities in the underworld. These scenes follow standard funeral iconography, but their selection and arrangement might tell us something. The emphasis on the funeral itself, on the transition from death to eternal life, could be straightforward religious messaging, or it could be documenting specific circumstances of this particular burial that were unusual or significant. Ancient Egyptian tomb art wasn't just decoration. It had religious and magical functions, serving as a guide and protection for the deceased's journey through the afterlife. The religious texts painted in the burial chamber come from the Amduat, a composition describing the sun god's journey through the 12 hours of the night, which paralleled the deceased's journey through the underworld. But the version in Tutankhamun's tomb is abbreviated, condensed from a much longer text. This makes sense given the time constraints, but it also means we're seeing a selective version, particular hours and passages chosen from the full composition. Why these particular selections? That's where Egyptologists debate interpretations. Some argue the choices were purely practical, picking the most essential passages that would fit in the available space. Others suggest the selection reflects specific concerns or beliefs about Tutankhamun's death and afterlife journey, that certain hours or passages were emphasized because of circumstances we don't fully understand. The burial chamber also contains the famous image of 12 baboons, representing the 12 hours of the night. Baboons were associated with the sun god and the cycle of death and rebirth. Their presence is standard in royal tomb iconography, but their specific arrangement and the details of how they're depicted might encode information we haven't recognized. Here's where we get into the really speculative territory. Some researchers have suggested that the decorations contain hidden messages or clues about the tomb's true configuration, that the ancient artists encoded information in the paintings that would be meaningful to initiates but invisible to others. This kind of hidden knowledge is consistent with Egyptian religious practice, which had different levels of understanding, from public ritual that everyone could witness to secret knowledge restricted to trained priests. The problem with this theory is that it's unfalsifiable. You can find patterns in anything if you look hard enough and are willing to interpret details selectively. Ancient Egyptian art followed strict conventions, but within those conventions there was room for variation, and that variation can be read many different ways. A figure facing left instead of right might be following a compositional rule, or it might be a deliberate signal. Without a key to the code, if there is one, we're just guessing. But let's consider what evidence actually supports the hidden chamber theory, beyond speculation and wishful thinking. The main physical evidence comes from those radar and thermal imaging studies that detected anomalies. The patterns in the data suggest differences in wall density and temperature that could indicate empty spaces beyond the visible chambers. Multiple studies using different technologies have detected similar anomalies in similar locations, which gives the findings some credibility. The anomalies appear behind the north wall of the burial chamber and behind the west wall of the treasury. These aren't random locations. The north wall is where the painted scene shows Ai performing rituals for Tutankhamun, where the religious texts begin their sequence. The west wall of the treasury is where the canopic shrine stood, the elaborate gilded structure that contained Tutankhamun's internal organs, preserved in miniature coffins. Both locations have religious and practical significance. If you were going to conceal additional chambers, these would be logical places. They're integrated into the tomb's ritual geography, positioned where their presence would make sense symbolically, even if they weren't meant to be accessed. A chamber behind the north wall could serve as a continuation of the burial chamber, a space for additional grave goods or for ritual purposes we don't understand. A chamber behind the treasury could be additional storage, possibly for the most valuable or sacred items. The counterargument is that these anomalies could have simpler explanations. Limestone is variable, and the valley's geology includes natural voids and fractures. The temperature differences that infrared imaging detected could result from variations in stone composition or moisture content, rather than empty spaces. The tomb was cut from living rock, and that rock wasn't homogeneous. Different layers have different properties, and those differences would show up in scanning data. Testing these competing explanations would require drilling or breaking through the walls, which brings us back to the conservation problem. Is the potential discovery worth the certain damage? The Egyptian authorities have said no repeatedly, and that decision is understandable. They're responsible for protecting an irreplaceable artifact that belongs not just to Egypt, but to human heritage. The pressure to find something spectacular is enormous, but so is the responsibility to preserve what we already have. There's also a practical consideration that doesn't get discussed much. What if we break through and find chambers that are disappointingly empty? Tomb robbers in antiquity were thorough. If there were accessible chambers, even hidden ones, there's a good chance they were found and looted long ago. We might discover empty rooms, spaces that once contained treasures, but now hold only dust and broken pottery. That would still be archaeologically interesting. It would answer questions about the tomb's layout and construction, but it wouldn't be the sensational discovery that everyone hopes for. And if there are chambers that were never accessed, even by ancient robbers, what condition would their contents be in? Tutankhamun's burial chamber was protected by multiple sealed doors, but it still suffered damage from humidity and geological movement over 3,000 years. The painted walls have deteriorated, colours fading, plaster cracking. The objects in the tomb, despite being found largely intact, showed various forms of degradation. Metal objects had corroded, organic materials had dried and become brittle. Even the gold had been affected by time. A hidden chamber, if it exists, might be in worse condition than the main tomb. It could have flooded, a common problem in the Valley of the Kings, where occasional rainstorms send water flowing through the ancient passages. It could have collapsed partially, the limestone ceiling fracturing under geological pressure. It could have been invaded by insects or bacteria that consumed organic materials. The fantasy of discovery imagines pristine chambers filled with perfect artifacts, but reality is usually less kind. Still, the possibility remains tantalizing. What could justify the risk and effort of investigation? The answer depends on what questions we're trying to answer. If we want to know whether Tutankhamun's tomb has hidden chambers purely to satisfy curiosity, that's interesting but probably not sufficient justification for destructive testing. If we want to understand ancient tomb construction techniques, there are other tombs we could study with less risk to an irreplaceable site. But if we believe hidden chambers might contain information that fundamentally changes our understanding of this period of Egyptian history, that calculation shifts. The question of what information could be worth the risk brings us to one of the most debated theories about Tutankhamun's tomb, that it might contain clues to the burial place of Nefertiti. This isn't idle speculation. There are legitimate historical reasons why Nefertiti's tomb might intersect with Tutankhamun's story, and understanding those reasons requires looking at the chaotic years that preceded his reign. Nefertiti was the wife of Akhenaten, the pharaoh who upended Egyptian religion by abandoning the traditional gods in favor of Aten, the sun disk. This wasn't just a theological shift. It was a complete reorganization of Egyptian society, with massive political and economic consequences. Akhenaten moved the capital from Thebes to a new city he built, Amarna, and he redirected resources from the old temples to his new religious order. The priests of Amun, who had been the most powerful religious institution in Egypt, suddenly found themselves marginalized. That created enemies, powerful ones, and those enemies would eventually have their revenge. Nefertiti was at the center of this transformation. She wasn't just Akhenaten's wife. She appears to have had unusual political power. depicted in royal art performing religious ceremonies and even smiting enemies, roles typically reserved for pharaohs. Some scholars argue she became co-regent with Akhenaten, ruling alongside him with equal authority. Then she disappears from the historical record. The last dated inscription mentioning her comes from year 12 of Akhenaten's reign. After that, nothing. No mention of her death, no record of her burial, no indication of what happened to one of the most prominent figures in Egypt. This disappearance has generated countless theories. Some argue she fell from favor and was exiled or died in disgrace. Others suggest she didn't disappear at all, but changed her name and continued to rule, possibly as the mysterious pharaoh Nefertiti, who appears in records after Akhenaten's death. A few scholars even propose she became Smenkhkare, another shadowy figure from this period, though that theory requires accepting that she ruled as a man, which complicates things considerably. What we know with more certainty is that Akhenaten died in year 17 of his reign, and the succession got messy. There's Smenkhkare, who might have been Akhenaten's son or brother or Nefertiti in disguise, depending on which theory you accept. There's Nefertiti, who might have been Nefertiti, or a daughter of Akhenaten, or a completely different person. And then there's Tutankhamun, who was originally named Tutankhaten before the religious restoration that changed his name and the direction of Egyptian history. Tutankhamun was about 9 years old when he became pharaoh. He didn't make the decisions that defined his reign. Those came from advisors, particularly I, who would eventually succeed him, and Horemheb, the military commander who became pharaoh after I. These men orchestrated the abandonment of Amarna, the return to Thebes, and the restoration of the old gods. They were cleaning up Akhenaten's mess, and part of that cleanup involved erasing him from history. His monuments were dismantled, his name chiseled off inscriptions, his city abandoned to the desert. But Nefertiti's fate in all this remains unknown. If she died during Akhenaten's reign, she might have been buried at Amarna in the royal tomb that archaeologists have found there. That tomb was damaged and looted in antiquity, and the royal mummies it once contained are gone. If she survived Akhenaten and ruled briefly as Nefertiti, she might have been buried elsewhere, possibly in the Valley of the Kings. And if she was Tutankhamun's mother, which is one possibility though not the only one, there's a theoretical reason she might be connected to his tomb. The evidence for this connection is indirect but intriguing. Tutankhamun's tomb contains objects that weren't originally made for him. Some items bear the names of his predecessors, including Nefertiti. This could mean the objects were inherited, or it could suggest they were taken from another burial and repurposed. There are also the mysterious female coffins and burial equipment found in KV55, a damaged tomb near Tutankhamun's that contained a male mummy, possibly Akhenaten. Those female items had to come from somewhere. Nicholas Reeves built his hidden chamber theory partly on these observations. He noticed that the decoration in Tutankhamun's burial chamber is unusual. The north wall shows A, dressed as pharaoh, performing the opening of the mouth ceremony on Tutankhamun's mummy. That's standard. But the way Tutankhamun is depicted, with dark skin associated with Osiris, suggests he's already been mummified and is being transformed into a god. The east wall shows Tutankhamun being welcomed into the afterlife by various deities. Again, normal iconography. But the west wall is different. It shows what appears to be a funeral procession, with 12 figures pulling a shrine on a sledge. Reeves argued this might represent Nefertiti's funeral, not Tutankhamun's. The shrine being pulled is the wrong shape for Tutankhamun's shrine, he said. It matches shrines associated with queens. And the presence of 12 figures, instead of the more typical number for a king's funeral, suggested a different identity for the deceased. Most Egyptologists found this unconvincing. The iconography isn't as unusual as Reeves claimed, and there are other explanations for the details he highlighted. The shrine's shape could be artistic convention rather than literal representation. The number of figures might not be significant, and the overall program of decoration fits what we'd expect for a king's burial chamber, even one created in haste. Yet the theory persists because it addresses a real problem. We don't know where Nefertiti is buried. We have mummies of relatively minor royals from this period, but the most famous queen in Egyptian history has vanished. Her disappearance is one of Egyptology's enduring mysteries, and solving it would be genuinely significant. Finding her tomb wouldn't just give us artifacts. It would potentially answer questions about the Amarna period, the religious revolution, and the succession crisis that followed Akhenaten's death. So there's motivation to look, even if the specific evidence for her being in Tutankhamun's tomb is weak. The problem is that looking isn't easy or safe, and the consequences of being wrong are severe. If we drill through the walls and find nothing, we've damaged an irreplaceable site for no gain. If we find empty chambers, we've learned something about tomb construction, but at significant cost. And if we find chambers that were looted in antiquity, we're left with more questions and a damaged monument. The alternative is to wait for better technology. Ground-penetrating radar is improving constantly. Muon tomography, which uses cosmic ray particles to image internal structures, has been successful at other archaeological sites. These techniques are non-invasive and getting more sophisticated every year. Maybe in a decade, we'll have scanning methods that can definitively show what's behind those walls, if anything, without requiring us to break through them. But waiting has its own costs. Every year that passes is another year of potential deterioration, another year where the tomb's condition might worsen, another year where we risk losing information to natural degradation or human interference. The tomb is monitored and protected, but it's not immune to geological processes or the gradual decay that affects all ancient structures. Water infiltration, salt crystallization, and structural instability are ongoing concerns. The longer we wait, the more we risk losing whatever might be there. This tension between caution and action plays out in every aspect of archaeology. We want to learn, to discover, to answer questions that have puzzled us for decades or centuries. But we also have a responsibility to preserve sites for future generations, who might have better tools and techniques than we do. Every archaeological excavation is partly destructive. We remove context, we disturb layers, we change the site by studying it. The question is always whether what we learn justifies what we inevitably destroy in the process of learning it. For Tutankhamun's tomb, the stakes are unusually high because of its symbolic importance. This isn't just another archaeological site. It's one of the most famous tombs in the world, visited by millions of people, reproduced in countless books and documentaries, part of global cultural consciousness. Damaging it would be noticed and criticized far more intensely than damaging a less famous site, even if the archaeological value was similar. That symbolic status cuts both ways. It means we have to be more careful, but it also means discoveries there would have more impact. Finding Nefertiti in Tutankhamun's tomb would be front-page news worldwide. It would reshape public understanding of ancient Egypt in ways that equally important discoveries at less famous sites wouldn't. That media attention could translate into funding for Egyptology, public support for archaeological preservation, and educational opportunities that benefit the field broadly. The counterargument is that we shouldn't let publicity considerations drive archaeological decisions. We should investigate sites based on their research potential, not their media appeal. A tomb's fame doesn't make it more archaeologically important than an unknown tomb that might contain equally valuable information. By focusing obsessively on Tutankhamun because he's famous, we might be neglecting other sites that could teach us just as much or more about ancient Egypt. There's truth to both positions. The reality is that archaeology depends on public support, which means public interest matters. Famous sites attract funding and attention, that enable other research to proceed. Tutankhamun's discovery in 1922 sparked worldwide Egyptomania that funded decades of archaeological work. A new major discovery in his tomb could have similar effects, generating resources that support broader research programs. But there's also danger in creating expectations we can't meet. The more we hype the possibility of hidden chambers and lost treasures, the more disappointed people will be if we find nothing. That disappointment could turn into skepticism about archaeology generally, a sense that archaeologists are always promising discoveries they can't deliver. We've seen this pattern before with other supposedly revolutionary findings that turned out to be less dramatic than initially claimed. The responsible approach is probably somewhere in the middle. We should investigate the possibility of hidden chambers, but with realistic expectations and appropriate caution. We should use non-invasive techniques as far as they can take us, and only consider invasive methods if the evidence becomes overwhelming. We should be honest about uncertainty and avoid promising discoveries we can't guarantee. And we should remember that even negative results have value. Learning that there are no hidden chambers would still answer a question and allow us to move forward with better understanding. That measured approach doesn't generate headlines, which is part of why it's hard to maintain. There's constant pressure for dramatic announcements, breakthrough discoveries, revolutionary findings. But science doesn't usually work that way. Progress comes through accumulation of evidence, careful testing of hypotheses, and gradual refinement of our understanding. The spectacular discoveries that make news are outliers, moments when accumulated careful work suddenly produces dramatic results. For Tutankhamun's tomb, we're still in the careful work phase. We're scanning, measuring, analyzing, debating. We're developing better techniques and gathering more data. We're trying to understand what we're looking at before we decide what to do about it. That's not exciting in the moment, but it's how responsible archaeology proceeds. The fascination with hidden chambers also reflects something broader about how we think about ancient Egypt. We tend to imagine it as a place of secrets and mysteries, where vast knowledge was hidden by priest kings who encoded cosmic wisdom in monuments and tombs. That's partly romantic fantasy, the legacy of 19th century occultism and early 20th century adventure fiction. But it's also rooted in something real. Ancient Egypt was genuinely sophisticated, with knowledge and capabilities that still impress us. They did hide things. They did build elaborate tombs with concealed chambers. And they did possess knowledge that was lost when their civilization declined. The question is how to separate legitimate mystery from fantasy, how to investigate real questions without getting distracted by unlikely speculation. Tutankhamun's tomb has plenty of genuine puzzles that don't require believing in hidden chambers. Why was it so small? Why does it contain objects from other burials? What exactly was the political situation when he died? How did his death affect the succession? These questions might seem less exciting than discovering a hidden queen's burial, but they're more likely to have answers we can actually find through careful study. And that careful study has revealed something about ancient Egyptian society that the tomb of Tutankhamun illustrates perfectly. The relationship between kingship and divinity wasn't what we often assume. We tend to think of pharaohs as god-kings who ruled with absolute power, their every whim becoming law. But the reality was more complex and more interesting. Tutankhamun became king around age 9, a child, someone who needed advisors and regents to actually govern Egypt. The tomb contains evidence of this political reality in ways we're still trying to fully understand. Some objects bear different royal names, suggesting they were borrowed from other burials or made for other people. Some inscriptions show signs of modification. The tomb's small size might indicate it wasn't originally intended for a king at all, but was hastily repurposed when the young pharaoh died unexpectedly. These aren't scandalous revelations. They're glimpses of how power actually worked in ancient Egypt, as opposed to how official propaganda claimed it worked. Pharaohs were supposed to be living gods, eternal and perfect. But real pharaohs were human beings who got sick and died young, who needed help running their kingdom, who sometimes had to make do with whatever tomb was available when they died unexpectedly. The contrast between ideology and reality shows up throughout the burial. The coffins present Tutankhamun as Osiris, the god of the dead, transformed through death into divine form. The inscriptions call him by all his official titles, emphasizing his role as king of Upper and Lower Egypt, beloved of the gods. The tomb's decoration shows him in the afterlife, accepted among the divine beings who rule eternity. But the physical evidence tells a different story. This was a young man who died around age 19, possibly from complications of a broken leg that became infected. Someone who needed a walking stick, several of which were buried with him. Someone whose mummy shows evidence of hasty embalming, perhaps because he died during the wrong season for ideal preservation. Someone whose tomb had to be prepared quickly, reusing whatever was available because there wasn't time to create everything from scratch. Understanding this tension between ideology and reality helps us interpret what we find in the tomb. Take the famous golden mask, probably the single most recognizable artifact from ancient Egypt. Its extraordinary craftsmanship, absolutely stunning in its detail and artistry. The face presents an idealized young king, serene and perfect, gazing into eternity with the confidence of someone who knows he's achieved divine status. But look closer, and you start seeing complications. The earlobes are pierced, which was unusual for male royal statuary, but common for women and children. Some scholars think the mask might have been started for someone else, possibly Nefertiti or another female royal, then modified for Tutankhamun. The cartouches containing his name look like they might have been altered. The gold itself comes from different sources, suggesting the mask was assembled from materials originally intended for different purposes. Does this make it less impressive? Not at all. It makes it more interesting. Instead of being a straightforward royal burial mask made specifically for Tutankhamun, it becomes evidence of the chaotic political situation following his death. People scrambling to give him an appropriate burial despite limited time and resources. Craftsmen repurposing whatever was available to create something worthy of a king. The mask is still magnificent, but it's also a historical document showing us how ancient Egyptians dealt with unexpected royal death. This pattern repeats throughout the tomb's contents. The shrine containing the canopic jars that held Tutankhamun's preserved organs was definitely made for someone else originally, probably Kia, one of Akhenaten's wives. The inscriptions were modified, names changed, but traces of the original text remain visible. Some of the Ushabti figures, the small statues meant to serve the king in the afterlife, appear to have been made for other people and modified with Tutankhamun's names. We're not talking about grave robbing or theft. We're talking about the realities of royal burial in a period of political uncertainty. Tutankhamun died young and apparently unexpectedly. The people responsible for his burial needed to provide him with everything required for the afterlife, and they needed to do it quickly. So they used what was available. They repurposed objects from other burials or from temple storage. They modified things that had been started for other people. They created new items when necessary, but borrowed when possible. This practical approach to burial equipment doesn't diminish the religious significance. Ancient Egyptians were intensely concerned with the afterlife, but they were also practical people who solved problems with available resources. The important thing was that the king had what he needed for eternity. Not necessarily that every single object was made specifically for him from scratch. What this reveals about ancient Egyptian religion is fascinating. We often imagine ancient religions as rigid systems where every detail had to be exactly right, or the whole thing failed. But Egyptian religion, like most actual religious practice, was more flexible than that. The core requirements needed to be met. The king needed his body preserved, his organs protected, his tomb equipped with food and furniture and everything necessary for eternal life. But exactly where those things came from mattered less than the fact that they were there. Modern archaeology sometimes struggles with this kind of complexity. We want clear answers. Either the tomb was made for Tutankhamun, or it wasn't. Either the objects were his, or they belonged to someone else. But reality rarely offers that kind of binary clarity. The tomb was adapted for Tutankhamun from something else. The objects were his because they were buried with him, even though some were originally made for other people. Both things are true simultaneously. This matters for how we think about those possible hidden chambers. If we found a sealed room containing burial equipment for Nefertiti or Kia, would that be evidence of their actual burial there? Or would it be storage for items that were going to be used elsewhere? Or objects that were already used elsewhere and later moved? Ancient Egyptians reused and repurposed things constantly. Finding objects associated with one person doesn't necessarily mean that person was buried there. We see this in other royal tombs from the same period. The tomb discovered in 1907, known as Cave I-55, contained burial equipment for several different people. There was a coffin made for Kia, canopic jars belonging to Akhenaten, and a mummy that might be Akhenaten, or might be someone else entirely. Archaeologists have been arguing about who was actually buried there for over a century. The simple presence of someone's burial equipment doesn't prove they were buried in that location. So if we did find a hidden chamber in Tutankhamun's tomb containing objects with Nefertiti's name, we couldn't immediately conclude that we'd found her burial. We'd need to look at the objects themselves, their condition, how they were arranged, what else was present. We'd need to consider whether this was an actual burial or a storage chamber or something else entirely. And we'd need to accept that we might never have enough evidence to be completely certain. That uncertainty bothers people. We want discoveries that answer questions definitively, that solve mysteries once and for all. But archaeology doesn't usually work that way. Every answer raises new questions. Every discovery adds complexity rather than providing simple resolution. The more we learn about ancient Egypt, the more we realize how much we still don't understand. Take something as basic as how the pyramids were built. We know they were constructed with copper tools, wooden sledges, and enormous amounts of human labor. We can see the ramps and the tool marks and the quarries where the stone came from. But the exact techniques used to move and position blocks weighing several tons remain debated. We have theories, some more plausible than others, but no definitive proof of exactly how it was done. Or consider Egyptian mathematics. We have mathematical papyri showing their calculations and problem-solving approaches. We can see they understood geometry well enough to design and build incredibly precise structures. But we don't fully understand their theoretical framework, how they thought about mathematical concepts, what they considered proven versus what was just practical technique. These gaps in knowledge aren't failures of archaeology. They're reminders that ancient people were complex, that their societies worked in ways we can only partially reconstruct from surviving evidence. Every tomb we excavate, every text we translate, every artifact we analyze adds to our understanding. But it also reveals how much we're missing, how much evidence has been lost over 3,000 years. Tutankhamun's tomb survived because it was buried under debris from later construction. Most royal tombs were robbed in antiquity, their contents scattered or melted down, their mummies destroyed or damaged. The fact that we have one relatively intact royal burial is extraordinary luck. But it's one example out of dozens of kings who ruled during the New Kingdom alone. We're trying to understand an entire civilization based on fragments and exceptional cases. This is why the possibility of hidden chambers matters beyond just finding more treasure. Each additional piece of evidence helps us build a more complete picture. If there are sealed rooms we haven't found yet, they might contain objects that answer questions about the period's politics, religion, art, or daily life. Or they might raise entirely new questions we haven't thought to ask. But the tomb has already given us so much to work with. The botanical evidence, for instance, has told us about Egyptian agriculture, trade networks, and funeral practices. The tomb contained flowers, carefully arranged in garlands and bouquets. Analysis of these flowers revealed they were placed there during specific seasons, helping us determine when the burial took place. The species included some that grew locally and others that must have been imported, showing us something about Egyptian trade and the importance placed on having the right flowers for funeral rituals. The food offerings provide similar insights. The tomb contained numerous jars of wine, labelled with vintage information like modern wine bottles, baskets of fruit, loaves of bread, cuts of meat, all carefully preserved for the afterlife. Analysis of these food items tells us about Egyptian diet, agricultural practices, and food preservation techniques. It also reveals the religious significance of different foods, which ones were considered appropriate for royal burials, and why. Even seemingly mundane objects like clothing and sandals provide valuable information. The tomb contained dozens of garments, from simple linen tunics to elaborate ceremonial robes decorated with gold and precious stones. Study of these textiles has revealed information about Egyptian weaving techniques, dye production, and fashion. The different styles of clothing reflect the king's various roles, as military commander, as religious officiant, as divine ruler. The weapons and chariots tell us about Egyptian military technology and warfare. The tomb contained numerous bows, arrows, and throwing sticks, along with protective armor and several dismantled chariots. Some of these were ceremonial objects, too elaborate for actual use, but others show signs of wear, suggesting Tutankhamun actually used them during his short life. Analysis of the chariots has revealed sophisticated understanding of weight distribution, wheel construction, and vehicle dynamics. All of this comes from a tomb we've already excavated. Imagine what we might learn from chambers that have remained sealed since ancient times. Not just more gold and jewels, though those would certainly be present, but organic materials preserved in sealed conditions. Documents written on papyrus or leather. Wooden objects that might have survived without exposure to moisture and decay. Evidence that could answer questions or raise new ones about a pivotal period in Egyptian history. The challenge is balancing the potential knowledge against the risk of damage. Every time we open a sealed space, we expose it to modern air and all the microorganisms and chemical processes that come with it. The famous curse of the pharaohs probably has some basis in the toxic molds that grow in sealed tombs and can make archaeologists sick. But there's also real risk to ancient materials from sudden environmental changes. This is where technology becomes crucial. If we can map what's in a sealed space before opening it, we can prepare appropriate conservation measures. We can have the right specialists present. We can plan the documentation and preservation work before we disturb anything. We can make informed decisions about whether opening a space is worth the inevitable risks. The alternative is to leave sealed chambers unopened, preserving them for future archaeologists who will have better technology and techniques. Some people argue this is the responsible choice, that we should wait until we can investigate without causing damage. But how long do we wait? Technology is always improving. If we always defer to the next generation, nothing ever gets excavated. And sealed chambers aren't perfectly stable. They're deteriorating slowly, affected by humidity, temperature fluctuations, and the gradual breakdown of ancient materials. The deeper question isn't just about technology or timing. It's about what we owe the past versus what we owe the future. Tutankhamun's tomb survived thousands of years before Carter found it. Should we assume our obligation is to preserve what remains for another 1,000 years? Or do we have a responsibility to extract knowledge while we can, accepting that some damage is inevitable in the pursuit of understanding? Consider this from a different angle. Every sealed chamber in Tutankhamun's tomb represents a time capsule from a specific moment in history. The day workers finished preparing the burial chamber and sealed it shut. They created a snapshot of 1323 BCE. Everything in that space reflects the beliefs, technologies, materials, and practices of that precise historical moment. It's not just about what the objects are, but what their arrangement and condition tell us about the people who placed them there. The burial process itself was incredibly complex. It wasn't simply a matter of putting a body in a coffin and closing a door. Egyptian royal burials involved elaborate rituals that took 70 days from death to final interment. During that time, priests performed ceremonies, embalmers preserved the body, craftsmen finished funerary equipment, and officials organized the logistics of transporting everything to the tomb. The final arrangement of objects wasn't random. It followed specific religious protocols we're still trying to understand. Some objects were placed in particular locations for ritual reasons. Others were positioned to maximize the limited space in the tomb's chambers. Still others seem to have been added hastily, suggesting last-minute changes to the burial plan. All of these details matter for understanding both the specific circumstances of Tutankhamun's death and burial, and the general practices of Egyptian royal funerals during the New Kingdom. Here's where sealed chambers become particularly valuable. The main burial chamber was disturbed, first by ancient thieves, then by Carter's excavation. We can reconstruct what was there, but we've lost information about the original arrangement. Sealed chambers, if any exist, preserve that original context. They show us exactly how ancient Egyptians organized burial spaces, which could answer questions about religious beliefs and practical considerations that texts alone can't address. But there's something else to consider. The very fact that we're having this conversation changes how we approach the tomb. Carter excavated with the best intentions and methods of his time. He documented everything carefully by 1920s standards. He preserved objects using techniques that seemed appropriate then. Some of those preservation methods, we now know, actually caused damage. The wax he used to stabilize fragile objects has discolored and degraded them. Some of his repairs to broken items have made modern conservation more difficult. We're probably making similar mistakes right now, using techniques that seem sound, but that future archaeologists will recognize as problematic. That's not an argument against investigation. It's a reminder that perfect preservation is impossible. Everything deteriorates. The question is whether we extract knowledge during the deterioration process, or simply watch things decay, while waiting for better methods that may never come. The scan results from 2016 didn't just look for chambers. They also examined the tomb's structure for stability issues. What they found was concerning. The tomb is slowly deteriorating. Tiny cracks in the walls are growing. Salt deposits are forming on painted surfaces. The rock itself is responding to thousands of years of temperature and humidity changes, plus decades of tourist traffic before the tomb was closed to regular visitors. This deterioration is happening whether we excavate or not. In fact, some conservators argue that sealed chambers might be more stable than opened ones, since they're not experiencing the air circulation and temperature fluctuations that come with access. But sealed doesn't mean perfectly preserved. Ancient tombs aren't hermetically sealed containers. They're carved from living rock that shifts, cracks, and allows moisture penetration over millennia. So we're in a strange position. We have technology that might reveal hidden chambers without opening them. We have conservation techniques that might preserve whatever we find. But we also have an obligation to future generations who will have even better technology and techniques. How do we balance these competing considerations? One approach is incremental investigation. Instead of immediately opening any discovered chambers, we could use progressively invasive techniques to learn more before making final decisions. First, use the best non-invasive scans to map what's there. Then perhaps drill tiny holes to insert fiber optic cameras, giving us visual information without major disturbance. Then take air samples to analyze what organic materials might be present. Each step provides more information to guide decisions about whether and how to proceed. This incremental approach has been used successfully at other archaeological sites. When investigators wanted to look inside a sealed chamber in the Great Pyramid, they drilled a tiny hole and inserted a camera rather than breaking through the stone. They discovered an empty space, saving the effort and damage of full excavation while preserving the chamber's integrity. If they'd found something significant, they would have had information to plan a proper excavation. But there's a counter-argument here too. Every tiny hole, every small intervention causes some damage. Multiple small investigations might collectively cause more harm than one well-planned excavation. And there's something to be said for comprehensive investigation rather than piecemeal exploration. When Carter opened Tutankhamun's tomb, he documented everything together, understanding how objects related to each other. Fragmentary investigation over many years might lose that holistic context. The political dimension adds another layer of complexity. Tutankhamun's tomb isn't just an archaeological site. It's a symbol of Egyptian heritage, a major tourist attraction, and a source of national pride. Decisions about investigation aren't made purely on scientific grounds. They involve Egyptian antiquities authorities, international archaeological teams, conservation experts, and various government ministries. Everyone has different priorities and concerns. Egypt has become increasingly protective of its archaeological heritage, partly in response to the colonial-era practice of removing artifacts to European and American museums. The preference now is for investigation by Egyptian teams or international collaborations that keep findings in Egypt. This is completely reasonable from a sovereignty perspective, but it can slow decision-making when multiple stakeholders need to reach consensus. There's also the question of public expectation versus scientific reality. When news outlets report on possible hidden chambers, they often focus on the treasure angle. Headlines about gold and jewels generate more interest than discussions of pottery sherds and textile fragments. This creates pressure to investigate for public relations reasons, to deliver the dramatic discoveries that people expect. But rushing investigation to meet public expectations is exactly the wrong approach for responsible archaeology. What makes this particularly frustrating is that we might already have some answers. After Carter finished excavating the tomb in 1932, he left his records and notes with the Egyptian Museum. These documents include detailed maps, photographs, and written observations about every aspect of the excavation. They represent thousands of hours of careful documentation. But here's the problem. Carter's records are scattered across multiple institutions. Some are in Cairo, some in Oxford, some in New York. They've never been fully digitized or compiled into a comprehensive database. Researchers trying to understand exactly what Carter found and where he found it have to piece together information from fragmentary sources. It's entirely possible that Carter's notes contain observations that would clarify whether sealed chambers exist. But no one has connected those particular dots. This points to a broader issue in archaeology. We're constantly generating new data through excavation and analysis, but we're not always good at organizing and synthesizing existing information. Before we drill holes or break through walls, maybe we should fully analyze the documentation we already have. Carter's photographs might show wall features that suggest hidden spaces. His notes might describe sounds or observations that indicate voids beyond known chambers. Recent efforts have begun digitizing and analyzing Carter's records more systematically. Researchers are using modern techniques to enhance old photographs, revealing details that weren't visible in the original prints. They're comparing Carter's written descriptions with his photographs and maps, looking for discrepancies that might indicate features he noticed but didn't fully investigate. This archival archaeology might not be as exciting as breaking into a sealed chamber, but it's risk-free and could provide crucial information. The broader context of Egyptian royal tombs also matters here. Tutankhamun's tomb is unusual because it was found largely intact, but it's not the only royal tomb in the Valley of the Kings. Dozens of other tombs have been excavated over the past 2 centuries, providing comparative information about typical tomb architecture and burial practices. Some of these tombs do have hidden chambers or secondary spaces that weren't immediately obvious. The tomb of Horemheb, one of Tutankhamun's successors, has a chamber that was missed during initial excavation and only discovered decades later. The tomb of Seti I includes passages and rooms that branch off the main axis in unexpected ways. These precedents suggest that hidden spaces in royal tombs aren't unprecedented. Egyptian architects sometimes included chambers that served specific ritual purposes or provided storage for burial equipment. But here's what's interesting about those other tombs. The hidden chambers, when found, generally contained either nothing or relatively minor objects. They weren't secret treasure rooms. They were functional spaces within the overall tomb design. If Tutankhamun's tomb has sealed chambers, they're probably similar. Useful for understanding tomb architecture and burial practices, but unlikely to contain the dramatic treasures that popular imagination expects. This relates to how we think about archaeological discovery more broadly. The public narrative around archaeology focuses on finding things, especially valuable or beautiful things. Museums display gold artifacts and decorated pottery because those are what attract visitors. But archaeologists know that the most scientifically valuable finds are often the least visually impressive. Seeds and pollen tell us about ancient diet and agriculture. Broken pottery sherds reveal trade networks and dating information. Soil samples contain chemical signatures of ancient activities. If sealed chambers exist in Tutankhamun's tomb, their real value wouldn't be in any objects they contain. It would be in the information they preserve about context, arrangement, and condition. A sealed chamber might contain organic materials that have completely decayed in the opened parts of the tomb. Plant remains could tell us about offerings and decorations. Textile fragments might preserve dyes and weaving patterns. Wooden objects could show construction techniques. All of this mundane stuff is scientifically more valuable than another gold mask, spectacular as that would be. The challenge is communicating this to the public and to funding agencies. It's hard to justify expensive investigation by saying, we might find some interesting seeds. It's much easier to get support by talking about possible treasure chambers. But this creates a disconnect between what archaeology actually delivers and what people expect. When Carter opened Tutankhamun's tomb, the treasure exceeded all expectations. That's now the standard against which all Egyptian discoveries are measured, which is completely unrealistic. Most archaeological investigation involves painstaking work on fragmentary materials that slowly build understanding through accumulation of small details. The spectacular discoveries like Tutankhamun's tomb are exceptions, not the rule. They're important partly because they're rare. If every Egyptian royal tomb had survived intact, Tutankhamun's burial would be less significant. Its value comes partly from being our best preserved example of practices we can only partially reconstruct from other, looted tombs. So what's the responsible path forward? We need to acknowledge that there isn't a perfect answer. Every option involves trade-offs. Investigating now means accepting some damage and working with current technology that future generations might view as primitive. Waiting means risking further deterioration of whatever might be there, plus the possibility that we're preserving nothing of value. Not investigating at all means potentially losing information that could never be recovered any other way. Perhaps the most honest approach is to proceed carefully with investigation while being transparent about the trade-offs. Use the best available non-invasive technology first. Share results openly so the international community can weigh in on next steps. If chambers are confirmed, take time to plan appropriate investigation methods rather than rushing to open them. Accept that some decisions might be to leave certain spaces sealed for now while investigating others. This isn't satisfying from a popular perspective. People want definitive answers and dramatic discoveries. But responsible archaeology is often about managing uncertainty and making careful decisions with incomplete information. The goal isn't to find treasure. It's to extract maximum understanding while causing minimum damage. knowing that perfect outcomes aren't possible. The broader implications of this situation extend beyond just Tutankhamun's tomb. They touch on fundamental questions about ownership, preservation, and access to cultural heritage. Who gets to make decisions about investigating ancient sites? The Egyptian government has sovereign authority over sites in Egypt, but these places are also part of human heritage that matters to people worldwide. Different cultures and communities have different relationships with the past and different ideas about appropriate treatment of burial sites. In many traditions, disturbing graves is deeply wrong, regardless of how much time has passed. The Western archaeological tradition emerged from practices that many now recognize as problematic. Early archaeologists often showed little respect for the dead they studied, or for the descendants of ancient peoples. Objects were removed from their contexts and sent to museums far from their places of origin. Human remains were studied without consent and often displayed in ways their cultures would have found horrifying. Modern archaeology tries to do better, but tensions remain. Indigenous communities in many countries have fought for decades to get ancestral remains repatriated from museums. These struggles have forced archaeologists to confront uncomfortable questions about whose interests their work serves. Similar issues arise with Egyptian archaeology, though the political dynamics are different. Egypt can and does assert control over its antiquities. Foreign teams work there only with permission and under Egyptian supervision. But economic pressures complicate things. Tourism brings vital revenue to Egypt. Major discoveries attract international attention that translates into visitors and money. This creates incentives to pursue spectacular finds rather than careful study of less glamorous materials. It also means decisions about investigation can be influenced by tourism considerations rather than purely scientific or preservation concerns. The Tutankhamun situation sits at the intersection of all these pressures. The specific question about sealed chambers also connects to larger patterns in how ancient Egyptian tombs were actually used and modified. We tend to think of tombs as built, sealed, and never opened until modern discovery. Reality was messier. Many tombs were entered repeatedly in ancient times for legitimate reasons. Family members might be added to multi-burial tombs. Priests conducted rituals that required access. Maintenance was sometimes needed when structures deteriorated. Even in Tutankhamun's case, there's evidence the tomb was entered shortly after the initial burial. Some objects show signs of hasty reorganization, suggesting robbers got in before the tomb was sealed more permanently. Ancient Egyptians knew their tombs were vulnerable and took various measures to protect them. They built false doors and dead-end passages. They plastered over real doorways to conceal them. They inscribed curses threatening anyone who disturbed the dead. These protective measures create interpretive challenges. When modern investigators find a plastered doorway, does it mean something important is behind it? Or is it a decoy meant to distract ancient thieves? When a passage is filled with rubble, is that original construction or later blocking? These questions matter for understanding what might be behind the anomalies in Tutankhamun's tomb. If the spaces are original features of the tomb's construction, they might contain important deposits. If they're later modifications, they could be empty spaces that served structural purposes. The way we investigate these questions has changed dramatically. When Carter opened Tutankhamun's tomb, photography was still relatively primitive. He relied heavily on drawings and written descriptions. Today, we have digital photography, 3D scanning, and chemical analysis techniques that can extract information from materials Carter never even thought to study. This raises interesting questions about timing. If we investigate the chamber question now, we'll use 2020's technology. In 50 years, what could investigators do that we can't? Waiting might seem prudent from that perspective. But this logic can extend indefinitely. There will always be better technology in the future. At some point, you have to work with what you have, or risk never investigating at all. The key is identifying when current technology is good enough to answer important questions without causing unnecessary damage. For the chamber question, radar and other scanning methods can now detect voids and differentiate between various materials behind walls with reasonable accuracy. That's probably sufficient to determine whether investigation is worth pursuing. What would full investigation involve if scanning confirms significant spaces? The careful answer is that it depends on what scanning reveals. If there's a large empty chamber, investigation might involve creating a small access point that could later be resealed. If there's a passage filled with objects, investigation would need to proceed incrementally, documenting everything before moving it. If organic materials are present, environmental controls would be essential to prevent deterioration once the space is opened. The technology exists to do all this reasonably well. Fiber optic cameras can examine spaces through tiny holes. Conservation techniques can stabilize fragile materials. Digital documentation can record spatial relationships that would be disturbed by investigation. The question isn't whether we have the technical capability, it's whether the potential information gain justifies the inevitable disruption and risk. This brings us back to the philosophical question about what archaeology is really for. Is it about satisfying curiosity, advancing scientific knowledge, preserving heritage, entertaining the public? All of these goals are legitimate, but they sometimes conflict. Curiosity and public interest push toward investigation. Scientific methodology demands careful documentation. Preservation concerns argue for minimal intervention. Heritage considerations require respect for the cultural context of sites. Different stakeholders prioritize these goals differently. Academic archaeologists emphasize scientific method and knowledge production. Museum professionals focus on preservation and public education. Egyptian authorities balance national pride, tourism revenue, and cultural heritage protection. The international public wants excitement and discovery. Finding an approach that respects all these perspectives is genuinely difficult. One useful framework is to think about what questions we're actually trying to answer. If the question is, does this tomb contain more treasure? The answer doesn't much matter scientifically. We already know Tutankhamun was buried with spectacular grave goods. More objects would be interesting, but wouldn't fundamentally change our understanding. If the question is, how was this tomb used and modified, that has real scientific value? It could tell us things about ancient burial practices and beliefs that we don't know from other sources. Similarly, if the question is, what organic materials and contextual information might be preserved in sealed spaces? That's scientifically valuable regardless of what specific objects are present. The absence of objects would itself be informative if it's original rather than the result of ancient looting. A sealed empty chamber might indicate the tomb was built with expansion space that was never needed. Or it might show that certain types of offerings were placed differently than we thought. These scientific questions can be answered through careful investigation, even if nothing spectacular is found. But they're harder to get people excited about, which affects funding and institutional support. There's a persistent tension between the public appetite for treasure and the archaeological focus on context and information. Tutankhamun's tomb is valuable scientifically because of what it tells us about burial practices, not because the objects are made of gold. But the gold is what captures imagination and drives interest. Managing this tension requires honest communication about what archaeology can and cannot deliver. Not every investigation will find something spectacular, most won't. But even apparently mundane discoveries contribute to larger understanding when integrated with other evidence. The challenge is maintaining support and funding for work that values small incremental advances over dramatic breakthroughs. In Tutankhamun's case, whatever investigation happens will be intensely scrutinized. Success will be measured partly by scientific standards, but also by public reaction and media coverage. This creates pressure to find something impressive, which can compromise careful methodology. Researchers might be tempted to rush or to make bold claims based on preliminary evidence. Resisting these pressures requires strong institutional support and clear communication about realistic expectations. The history of Egyptology includes cautionary examples. Various announced discoveries turned out to be less significant than initial claims suggested. Chambers that were supposed to contain major finds held only rubble. Objects that seemed unique turned out to have known parallels. Scientific reputations were damaged and public trust eroded. The lesson is that it's better to be cautious than to overpromise and underdeliver. For the current situation, this means investigators need to be clear about what scanning has actually shown versus what speculation exists. If investigation proceeds, preliminary findings should be reported carefully with appropriate caveats. The media will inevitably hype whatever is announced, but researchers can at least try to provide accurate information, even if headlines simplify and sensationalize it. There's also the question of how investigation would be documented and shared. Carter published detailed volumes about his work in Tutankhamun's tomb, but much information was never fully recorded or has since been lost. Modern digital documentation standards are much higher. Everything can be photographed, measured, and recorded in ways that preserve information, even if physical objects deteriorate or contexts are disturbed. This documentation becomes part of the permanent scientific record that future researchers can access. But creating and maintaining this documentation requires resources and long-term commitment. Digital files need curation and preservation, just like physical objects. Formats become obsolete. Storage media fail. Without proper management, digital records can be lost even more completely than paper ones. Any investigation of potential chambers should include plans for comprehensive documentation and long-term preservation of all data collected. The international collaborative nature of modern archaeology also matters here. Major investigations increasingly involve teams from multiple countries and institutions. This brings diverse expertise, but also requires coordination and agreement on methodology. Egyptian authorities work with foreign institutions that provide funding and technical capability. These partnerships can be productive, but also involve navigating different priorities and approaches. In cases like Tutankhamun's tomb, which has such high profile, political and diplomatic considerations inevitably affect decision-making. Major discoveries become matters of national pride. Announcing findings involves complex negotiations about credit and recognition. These factors shouldn't drive scientific decisions, but they can't be ignored either. Researchers need to work within these realities while trying to maintain scientific integrity. The emotional dimension of this work also deserves acknowledgement. Archaeologists are humans who get excited about potential discoveries. That excitement can cloud judgment, but it also motivates the hard work investigation requires. The key is channeling enthusiasm into careful methodology, rather than letting it drive premature conclusions. Skepticism and excitement need to coexist productively. For people following this situation from outside, it's worth remembering that answers often take time. Investigation proceeds at a pace that can seem frustratingly slow to observers who want immediate resolution. But archaeological work can't be rushed without sacrificing quality. Each step needs to be done carefully, with appropriate documentation and analysis. Results need to be peer-reviewed before being announced. This process serves important purposes, even when it tries patience. The other thing worth remembering is that archaeology is fundamentally about asking questions rather than finding answers. Each discovery raises new questions, even as it answers old ones. Tutankhamun's tomb has been studied for a century and still generates new research projects. If sealed chambers are investigated, whatever is found will prompt decades of additional study and interpretation. There's no moment when we know everything and can move on. Understanding keeps deepening and evolving. This iterative nature of archaeological knowledge sometimes frustrates people who want definitive conclusions. We're trained to expect that investigation leads to answers that settle questions permanently. But that's not how it works with ancient evidence. New information requires reinterpreting old conclusions. Better methods reveal things previous researchers missed. Different analytical frameworks generate different insights from the same material. So the question about sealed chambers in Tutankhamun's tomb won't be settled by a single investigation, regardless of what that investigation finds. It will contribute to ongoing dialogue about ancient Egyptian burial practices, about the specific circumstances of this pharaoh's death and burial, about preservation and investigation ethics, and about how we value and study the past. That's both more complex and more interesting than simply finding hidden treasure, even if it's less cinematically satisfying. The practical question that remains is what actually happens next with this investigation. As of now, the situation sits in a kind of limbo. Reeves proposed his theory. Scans were conducted. Results proved inconclusive. Additional investigation was proposed, but hasn't moved forward. This stalled state reflects the complex factors involved in making decisions about such a significant site. One element that affects the timeline is simple logistics. Tutankhamun's tomb receives thousands of visitors annually. It's a major attraction in the Valley of the Kings. Any investigation requiring extended access to the tomb needs to account for tourism revenue and visitor expectations. Egypt's economy depends significantly on tourism, and Luxor depends heavily on visitors coming to see ancient sites. Closing or restricting access to the tomb for investigation involves real economic costs that need to be weighed against potential benefits. The tomb's current condition also factors into decisions about intervention. After a century of visitors, the paintings on the walls have deteriorated from humidity, carbon dioxide, and physical contact. Conservation efforts have worked to stabilize these paintings and prevent further damage. Any investigation needs to ensure it doesn't compromise these conservation gains. The tomb's environment has been carefully controlled. Introducing equipment or altering conditions could affect preservation. There's also the question of what investigation methods to use. Ground-penetrating radar produced ambiguous results. More invasive methods might provide clearer answers but involve greater risk. Physical drilling to insert cameras would leave permanent marks. Even if holes are small, they alter the tomb. Archaeologists generally prefer non-invasive methods when possible, but sometimes invasive techniques are necessary to answer questions. The decision about how far to go involves weighing knowledge gained against alteration caused. Some experts have suggested that investigation might be premature given current technology. Methods improve continuously. Techniques that seem invasive now might become obsolete within decades. Equipment that produces ambiguous results today might be replaced by technology offering much clearer data. From this perspective, waiting allows future researchers to investigate with better tools and less risk. Of course, this argument can justify infinite delay. At some point, you have to work with available methods or accept that questions won't be answered. The Nefertiti hypothesis specifically has become less central to discussions about potential chambers. Even researchers who believe chambers exist often separate that question from speculation about what they might contain. Chambers could exist without containing Nefertiti. The burial could belong to someone else entirely. It might contain storage or offerings rather than burial. The connection between chambers and Nefertiti was always speculative, but media coverage often presented them as linked. Separating these questions allows more focused investigation. What seems increasingly clear is that if investigation proceeds, it needs to be framed as archaeological research rather than treasure hunting. The goal should be understanding ancient practices, not finding spectacular artifacts. That framing affects methodology and interpretation. It means taking time to do things properly, even if that's less exciting. It means being willing to accept mundane findings rather than hoping for dramatic revelations. Archaeological investigation serves purposes beyond satisfying curiosity. The ethical framework for this decision extends beyond Egypt to international archaeological practice generally. How we handle sites of global significance sets precedents. The decisions made about Tutankhamun's tomb will influence how similar situations are approached elsewhere. If investigation proceeds without adequate preparation, or if results are announced prematurely, that affects standards worldwide. Conversely, if investigation demonstrates rigorous methodology and appropriate caution that raises the bar for others, public interest in this question isn't going away. People remain fascinated by Tutankhamun and by the possibility of undiscovered chambers. That interest can be positive if it supports archaeological research and heritage preservation. It becomes problematic when it creates pressure for premature action or sensationalized reporting. Managing public expectations while maintaining scientific standards is an ongoing challenge for everyone involved in heritage management. Education plays a role here too. Most people learn about archaeology through popular media that emphasizes discovery and treasure. The actual work of careful documentation, analysis, and interpretation gets less attention because it's less visually dramatic. But that careful work is what makes archaeology valuable. Helping people understand why investigation takes time and why caution matters serves long-term interests, even if it frustrates short-term curiosity. The situation also highlights tensions between different ways of valuing the past. Archaeological value focuses on information and context. Historic value emphasizes continuity and authenticity. Economic value relates to tourism and development. Symbolic value involves identity and meaning. These different frameworks don't always align. What makes sense from an archaeological perspective might conflict with economic or political priorities. Navigating these tensions requires recognizing that all these values are legitimate, even when they compete. For Egypt specifically, ancient heritage carries enormous significance. It's central to national identity and global reputation. It drives tourism that supports millions of livelihoods. It represents cultural achievements that inspire pride. These stakes make decisions about major sites particularly weighty. Egyptian authorities bear responsibility for protecting heritage that belongs both to Egypt and to human history generally. That's a difficult position, requiring careful judgment. The international dimension adds another layer of complexity. Foreign institutions provide much of the funding and technical expertise for Egyptian archaeology. This creates productive partnerships, but also raises questions about authority and credit. Who decides how investigation proceeds? Who analyzes the results? Who announces findings? These aren't just procedural questions. They involve fundamental issues about sovereignty and cultural ownership. Post-colonial archaeology tries to address these concerns by prioritizing local authority and collaborative models, but tensions remain. Looking at how this situation has unfolded since Reeves first proposed his theory reveals how archaeological discourse actually works. Initial claims get media attention. Other researchers examine the evidence and offer critiques. Additional investigation attempts to resolve disagreement. Results often prove ambiguous, leading to further debate. Consensus emerges gradually, if at all. This process frustrates people expecting clear answers, but it reflects how knowledge develops in any field. Science proceeds through questioning and testing, not through revelations. The role of technology in this story is particularly interesting. Radar scanning promised to answer questions non-invasively. It produced data, but interpreting that data proved difficult. Different experts reached different conclusions from the same scans. This pattern repeats throughout archaeology. New technology generates enthusiasm about what it might reveal. Actual application produces complex results requiring interpretation. Technology provides tools, but doesn't eliminate the need for human judgment. Comparisons to other archaeological mysteries offer perspective. Many ancient sites raise questions we can't currently answer. Some of those questions eventually get resolved through new evidence or methods. Others remain mysterious indefinitely. Stonehenge's purpose has been debated for centuries. The exact construction methods for the pyramids continue to generate discussion. These unsolved puzzles don't diminish the value of these sites. Mystery itself can be meaningful, prompting continued investigation and thought. The specific question of whether Nefertiti is buried in the Valley of the Kings matters less than broader issues this situation raises. How do we investigate important sites responsibly? How do we balance different interests and values? How do we communicate uncertainty while acknowledging legitimate curiosity? These questions affect archaeology worldwide. The answers we develop through cases like this shape the field's future. One thing that seems certain is that Tutankhamun's tomb will continue generating research regardless of whether hidden chambers exist. The artifacts require ongoing conservation. New analytical techniques reveal information from objects studied for decades. Digital documentation creates unprecedented access for researchers. Understanding of ancient Egyptian culture continues evolving, prompting reinterpretation of familiar material. The tomb's scientific value doesn't depend on dramatic new discoveries. The preservation challenges alone ensure continued attention. The paintings have deteriorated significantly since the tomb's discovery. Climate control systems protect them, but can't reverse existing damage. Digital documentation preserves information even as physical material degrades. Future visitors might experience the tomb primarily through reproductions that protect the original. This shift from physical to digital access raises questions about authenticity and experience that extend beyond Egypt to heritage sites worldwide. Climate change adds urgency to preservation concerns. Rising temperatures affect ancient sites throughout Egypt. Flooding risks increase. Preservation methods developed for current conditions may need revision. These environmental pressures affect decisions about investigation timing. Waiting might mean dealing with worse conditions later. Acting now might prevent future damage. These practical considerations influence the purely archaeological questions about whether and how to investigate. The economic dimension also keeps evolving. Tourism patterns change. Technology creates new ways to experience heritage remotely. Egypt has invested in developing tourist infrastructure while working to protect sites from tourism damage. These investments create expectations about access and revenue. Major sites like Tutankhamun's tomb are assets that need to generate income while being preserved. Balancing these goals requires sophisticated management. For people watching this situation from outside Egypt, it's worth considering what our interest reveals about how we relate to the ancient past. Why does the possibility of hidden chambers fascinate us so much? Partly, it's the treasure-hunting narrative that popular culture has made compelling. Partly, it's the appeal of solving mysteries, but perhaps it also reflects desire for connection to distant times and cultures. Ancient Egypt represents achievements that still impress us. Discovering more feels like recovering lost knowledge. That desire for connection is legitimate and valuable. It motivates the support for archaeology and preservation that these fields need to function. But it needs to be channeled productively. Interest should support careful investigation rather than demanding quick answers. Enthusiasm should acknowledge expertise rather than treating all opinions as equally valid. Fascination should extend to the patient work of analysis, not just the excitement of discovery. The media's role in shaping public understanding of this situation has been significant. Initial reports emphasize the possibility of finding Nefertiti, creating expectations that may not be met. Subsequent coverage of conflicting expert opinions left many people confused about what evidence actually shows. This pattern is common in science reporting generally. Preliminary findings get more attention than follow-up studies. Disagreement among experts gets framed as controversy rather than normal scientific discourse. Improving this communication matters because public support affects funding and policy decisions about heritage preservation. If people understand why investigation takes time and why results are often ambiguous, they're more likely to support the resources needed for proper work. If they expect quick answers and dramatic discoveries, they may lose interest when reality proves more complex. Building realistic expectations serves everyone's interests. The question of sealed chambers in Tutankhamun's tomb ultimately functions as a case study in how archaeology works. It involves hypothesis formation, evidence gathering, interpretation, debate, and potential further investigation. It requires balancing scientific curiosity with preservation responsibilities. It involves multiple stakeholders with different priorities. It plays out in public view, creating opportunities for education, but also pressure for conclusions. These elements characterize major archaeological questions generally. Whether chambers exist may eventually be determined through investigation, or the question might remain unresolved indefinitely. Either outcome would be legitimate. Not every question needs to be answered, especially if answering requires unacceptable risks or costs. Sometimes acknowledging uncertainty is the most honest response to ambiguous evidence. That's a hard lesson in a culture that values certainty and closure, but it's fundamental to how knowledge actually develops. What we can say with confidence is that Tutankhamun's tomb will continue to be studied, preserved, and visited for generations. Its significance doesn't depend on containing additional hidden chambers. The artifacts already recovered have transformed understanding of ancient Egypt. The tomb's discovery changed archaeology and captured global imagination in ways that still resonate. That legacy ensures continued attention regardless of what future investigation might reveal. The careful work of documentation, analysis, and preservation continues in laboratories and storage facilities away from public view. Researchers study the thousands of objects Carter catalogued. Conservation specialists work to prevent further deterioration. Digital archivists create records that will outlast physical materials. This patient, unglamorous work is what actually advances understanding. It deserves recognition, even though it makes less compelling headlines than speculation about hidden chambers. For now, the tomb keeps its secrets if it has any. The walls stand where ancient builders placed them. The paintings fade slowly, despite conservation efforts. Tourists file through, awed by what remains. Researchers debate methodology and interpretation. Egyptian authorities weigh competing priorities. And somewhere beneath the desert sand, whatever is there continues waiting, as it has for over 3,000 years, for us to decide what we're willing to do to find out. The fascination with what might lie behind those plastered walls in Tutankhamun's tomb reveals something about how we engage with history itself. We want answers, preferably dramatic ones. We want mysteries solved and treasures revealed. But the ancient world doesn't organize itself around our narrative preferences. Sometimes the most honest position is acknowledging what we don't know while respecting the limitations of what we can safely investigate. Whether Nefertiti rests somewhere in the Valley of the Kings, whether sealed chambers wait behind decorated walls, whether future technology will reveal secrets current methods can only hint at, these questions may never be definitively resolved. That's frustrating, but also strangely appropriate. The ancient Egyptians built their tombs to last for eternity, to protect their dead through millennia. The fact that some secrets have survived 3,000 years of investigation suggests they understood permanence better than we sometimes give them credit for. What matters now is how we proceed. Careful methodology over sensationalism, preservation alongside investigation, respect for the dead, whose resting places we disturb in the name of knowledge. Recognition that every choice involves trade-offs between what we might learn and what we might damage in the learning. The tomb will still be there tomorrow, and next year, and next century. Whatever is hidden will remain hidden until we develop methods to reveal it safely, or until we decide that some mysteries are worth preserving rather than solving. Either outcome honors the remarkable achievement that tomb represents, not just as a repository of ancient treasures, but as a window into a civilization that understood something we're still learning: that the most valuable things aren't always the most visible ones. The story of Tutankhamun's tomb isn't really about gold masks and hidden chambers. It's about how we value the past, how we balance curiosity against responsibility, and how we decide what we owe to both the dead and the future. Those questions don't have simple answers. They require ongoing conversation, careful thought, and willingness to accept that sometimes the best decision is patience rather than action. So the walls remain standing, painted with scenes of a young king's journey into eternity. The debates continue in academic journals and archaeological conferences. The tourists keep coming, drawn by the mystique of the boy pharaoh whose tomb survived when all others were lost. And somewhere in the darkness beneath the desert, whether in sealed chambers or in the spaces between our certainty and our speculation, the ancient world keeps its counsel, waiting to see if we're wise enough to approach its secrets with the care they deserve.